Hello, bonsai friends. This is Evan Pardue of Underhill Bonsai, and welcome to episode 45 of Little Things for Bonsai People, the podcast. Today, I'm going to be interviewing Randy Bennett. How you doing today, Randy?
Excellent.
Excellent. Awesome. We're going to be talking about bald cypress bonsai and Randy's history in basically just in bonsai in New Orleans. I've talked about Randy a little bit on previous episodes, so we finally got the man on the show. So we'll be going through all that. But before I go too far, I want to mention that our show is sponsored by our patrons over on patreon.com/little things for bonsai people. Like I've said before, and many, many times, if it wasn't for these people, we wouldn't be able to do the show. The show wouldn't be possible. So I'm going to start the list off with Tori Solis, Vicky Auth, Boyd Snellgrove, Ricky Ruins, Joshua Bentley, Snappy Chappers, Ryan Giordano, Joel Jenkins, Justin Knight, Backyard Bonsai Australia, Green Witch Gardens, Taylor Peacock, Chase Pertweet, Austin Atkins, Karen Codswell, Urian in Bonsai Garden, Luis Torres, AC Castle, and Bonsai Marine. Thank you guys so much for sponsoring the show and being Bonsai Best Buds. But I can't also fail to mention the editor of our show, Matt O'Donnell. He's a bass player in Nashville, Tennessee. He's an amazing guy. He makes it sound smart. He cleans up the show, makes it sound really good and digestible, so you guys can listen to it on your morning drive to work, or you can just listen to it while you're working on your trees. So thank you so much, Matt, for making the show awesome and sounding great. So Randy, I know we were working through a couple of technical issues this morning, but we got you on the show. How's it going over there in the city? You're not too far from me, actually.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you inviting me to come on the show. I appreciate that. And especially to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is bald cypress.
Definitely. I talk about bald cypress a lot. I don't know if people who listen to our show get tired of hearing me mention bald cypress. Just kind of like hand over fist talk about, like, they're one of the best species to work with in North America. They do everything that you want bonsai to do when it comes to developing them earlier on. And then whenever you start to really refine them, they do everything like above and beyond. Deciduous conifers, I mean, I think they're just, if you don't have one in your collection here, especially if you live in Louisiana, I mean, you're kind of missing out on a great opportunity to work with a really awesome species.
Exactly. Yeah, it's one of the few species you can't kill by overwatering.
Yeah, it's truly a water-loving tree for sure. And that's one of the things we can kind of talk about after we kind of talk about your history, and is we have a lot of questions that have come in about, submerging trees versus not submerging them and just hand watering them and all that good stuff. But before we get to the really technical stuff, tell the listeners about your background in bonsai, Randy.
Well, 1971, my father brought home a little Japanese maple bonsai from work. There was a gentleman at his office that grew bonsai, an Oriental gentleman. And so my father, not really sure why, but he bought one and brought it home and gave it to me. And that was it. I mean, I was hooked, and then quickly proceeded to kill everything I laid my hands on. I was not using. There wasn't anybody selling bonsai pots back then that I knew about. You go to a nursery to buy pots, and you can either buy them, looks like a big flower pot, or something that didn't have holes in it. And I tried both, and like I said, didn't know anything about soil. And I actually took the bus. I was in high school. It was a junior in high school. I took the bus down to the public library in New Orleans, and I found one book on bonsai. I checked it out. Never brought the book back. I probably owe about $3,000 in library fines at this point. But today, I mean, it's really like, I look at it from time to time, and it's really laughable, what was in that book way back then. But anyway, that kind of gave me a little bit of information. And then I found out about the Bonsai Society here in New Orleans in 1980. So I had a full 9 years to kill trees before hooking up with those guys. They had a BCI convention at a hotel, excuse me, down on Canal Street. So I went down there and saw that. And in that exhibit was a bald cypress by Dave DeGroat.
Yep.
And I must have stood in front of that bald cypress for a good half hour, just looking at it from every angle. I was just fascinated with it. And so I joined the club on the spot. And soon after the convention was over, Dave DeGroat did a 6-week beginner course that I signed up for. And then I just dove in off the deep end at that point and started going over to David's house, started talking with Vaughn Banting and Donna Banting, and just got into the club full force. Then Vaughn kind of took me under his wing as well and started having me do programs for the club, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been at it ever since. I opened my own nursery back in those days and shut it down in 2005 when Katrina came along and killed all 200 trees of mine that I had at that point in the backyard. Took a vacation, if you will, from bonsai, because after you've been growing trees since the 70s and 80s, and then you lose everything after a hurricane. That's kind of devastating. So I took a step back for almost 5 years before going out. And what was the first thing I did? I went out and collected a big bald cypress and got started back into it again.
Mm-hmm. And if that's the same bald cypress I'm thinking of, that's the one you showed at the Texas show, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
And I've posted pictures of that tree. And then have you posted anything anywhere of it outside of the bald cypress Facebook group that you started?
No,
Okay.
that's it.
All right. If with your permission, I'll share it again on Instagram so people can see it.
Sure.
It's an amazing tree. It's very, very, I would say old school, kind of classical, formal upright, very good taper. And we were able to grow knees on it after collection, which is also just something that you don't see very often. So yeah. And you mentioned David DeGroat earlier, and if people haven't really listened to a lot of his other episodes he's been featured in, like I know he's been featured on a few other shows. He's been on our show, but I don't think a lot of people know that he was in New Orleans for a good while. He's a native New Orlean.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I can't remember exactly at what time he joined the Pacific Bonsai Museum. But he was here for quite some time. Obviously he had been doing bonsai for you to see that tree. But yeah, that's just an awesome connection to hear right there. That was one of your first like influences that you had seen, especially in a bald cypress.
Yeah. I think he left to go up to the Pacific Rim collection somewhere in the mid 80s, I think, somewhere around that time anyway.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact opening date of the Pacific Rim before it was Pacific Bonsai Museum now. But yeah, I think there was a magazine. I had found it at one of the New Orleans clubs. It was just kind of sitting there. I want to say it was 1989. I think there was even like a Bonsai Today article written on it opening. But yeah, that's a lot of stuff that I like to. One of the things I like to do every once in a while is kind of connect bonsai history together and try to let people know that Louisiana bonsai is very relevant. It just hasn't been a lot of recorded history for as far as bonsai goes here, unfortunately. Right. So, but yeah, Vaughn Banting comes up a lot as well. And so from my understanding, you were very good friends with Vaughn. And then you also worked with Guy every once in a while whenever he was being trained with Vaughn as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Vaughn, the very first public program I ever did, little lecture, Vaughn asked me to do it for the club one night, and I was nervous as could be. I had never done a program on bonsai. Trying to here I am, basically a newbie to the club, and Vaughn has me standing up in front of everybody talking about Chinese elms. So I'm standing up and I'm well prepared. I've got my notes. I've got everything ready. I'm talking, and all through the little lecture, every once in a while, people would start laughing, and I'm like, "Oh, geez, is my zipper down?" I'm trying to discreetly check to make sure, and they would just keep laughing. Then they would go quiet. And after a few minutes, they would start laughing again. I kept going. I just, gave my program, and everybody had no idea. I wasn't saying anything funny. And then afterwards, people came up and said, "Oh, I gotta go ahead and tell you, Vaughn sat in the back with a laser pointer, and every few minutes he would lower it from the ceiling down and put it right in the center of your forehead, and that's when everybody." So Vaughn was a great guy, but he was also a real practical jokester. He was always clowning around, but the knowledge that man had on horticultural techniques and bonsai was just unbelievable. Between him and Dave DeGroat, I learned so much from those guys, and they had a lot of great people. Guy came in and started learning from Vaughn, as did a bunch of other gentlemen in the club, Gary Marshall and Dow Cousins. There was a lot of us that learned a heck of a lot from Vaughn.
And Vaughn, he opened the Bantings nurseries in New Orleans, right? That's like all from his family heritage, right?
Right. His father, I'm not sure when it got started, but I know his father was running it when Vaughn was small, and just a teenager going over there working on trees and stuff. Actually Vaughn started putting he would take coat hangers and take the coat hanger, undo the coat hanger, and use the wire of the coat hanger to shape trees in the nursery and put bins in them and so forth. And his father came along one day and says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I'm bending this tree. I'm putting movement into it and everything." His father said, "You're doing bonsai." He said, "What?"
I mean, this would have been much earlier. And
yeah.
I mean, as far as like, and this is one of the things I try to touch on a little bit with some people. I know if they're in a certain region, it's like, where was the earliest bonsai within their region? And so obviously a lot of the early exposure for us would have been just like you said, the early book that you found in the library. And I also know about, there was a run of Sunset like hobbies and activities books that just mentioned bonsai back in the day. And I think that was like the 60s, which is crazy, but there was definitely a golden age of bonsai that you were like fortunate enough to be in, was like the 70s and the 80s when it was really starting to kick off.
Oh yeah. That's when Vaughn and Donna would get people like John Naka, Ben Oakey, and people like that. They would get them in for like a week at a time. And they would just live at their house, and they would do bonsai all day, every day. And, they would invite a handful of the members over. And, God, I mean, it was really incredible. And John Knock, he's another one of those jokester guys. He's, oh man, he had just, Vaughn asked me to come over there one evening for wine and cheese with John, and there was a couple of other guys from the club that he invited. And John Naka had just gotten back from a tour in Africa, and so he pulls out of his little coat. He pulls out these 2 bags of seeds, and he opens up one of the bags, and he gives each of us some of the seeds. He says, "Now I want you to take those seeds and put them in your mouth, put them in the cheek, inside your cheek. And nobody said a word. I mean, if John Naka tells you to put some seeds in your mouth, you don't ask questions, you just put the seeds in your mouth. So that's what we did. And then he starts telling us about how these are from the baobab tree, but they're very difficult to get to germinate, and that there were only two ways. One was you had to put the seed in a vise, and he would show us this little point on the seed and said, you take the smallest drill bit you have, and you just penetrate that outer shell, and then you plant the seed. So the only other way is through the elephants. The elephants, they would come up with their trunks and they would strip off the leaves and eat the leaves. And of course, they would get some of the seed pods. And the digestive system in an elephant's stomach is very, very hot. And it was the heat that would crack open those seeds. And then when the elephants would poop, then the seeds were cracked. They were ready to germinate, and they're already in fertilizer. So he said, I collected seeds from the pods, and just to be on the safe side, because I didn't know if the drilling technique would work, I pulled a bunch of seeds from elephant poop. And he said, I wish I should have labeled which bag was which. Of course, everybody starts spitting out the seeds, and John and Vaughn start laughing their fool heads off, But yeah, so he was just as much a jokester as Vaughn was.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have those gentlemen here, but they went too soon, it'd be awesome to see what they thought about modern day bonsai now. But that's why we have these conversations, so we can have this somewhere to kind of look back. I mean, these are really important moments these are only like hearsay or just spoken. I've heard stories through the clubs of Baton Rouge, New Orleans, of just various artists that come. And for a long time, they were just always very small communities. So, but yeah, thank you for sharing those stories. I know, if anyone, I know a lot of people use Facebook now. You can go over to, Bald Cypress Bonsai. It's a Facebook group that was started not too long ago. It's probably like a month ago now at this point. You have a lot of members now, and a lot of people have been sharing very beautiful trees on there. And I've gotten to see a few pictures that I know have probably never seen the internet. They've just been sitting in files on people's computers. And I think you had shared a picture of Von Banting standing with Kimura when he had visited his garden at one point.
Right.
I never knew that happened. I had heard that Kimura had visited the United States and did a tour, but that picture is, it's so 80s. It's so, you can tell how young they are in those photos, and you can see Von's trees in there. He had a beautiful bonsai garden.
Yeah. And Vaughn had been struggling for years to get his flat top bald cypress designs accepted. And every time you had particularly masters from Japan come to New Orleans, and he would talk about flat top bald cypress, it was just dismissed out of hand. Luckily, a few of those people, he managed to get out into the swamp and actually show them what he was talking about and how these trees look when they're mature. And Vaughn made the comment. He said when Kimura visited his garden and Kimura asked to have a picture taken with Vaughn next to his flat top, Vaughn said at that moment he felt like he had finally made it, because if Kimura was willing to accept his design and asked to be photographed with it, he felt like he had finally made it. Yeah,
that recognition is more than enough, and that's kind of what Vaughn ran with, and we can see a lot of photos like I mentioned earlier, the Pacific Bonsai Museum. Before we were setting this meeting up, I just saw they shared a picture of one of Von's trees they've had in his collection for a long time. Also, there's his tree that's been at the National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. that's been there for a good while as well. I know it's hard to see a lot of his trees, but now it's kind of carried on through tradition, which is where you're kind of picked up on it, and you still teach flat top bald cypress pretty regularly. You have a group study that you've been running for you're about 3 years in, instructing people how to bring Yamadori to flat top.
Right. Yeah. We've done. I've started a few groups in Louisiana and in Texas mostly. But yeah, it takes about 3 years to really get them to the point to where, okay, now you're at the point you've learned enough where you can kind of take off on your own and finish the design. So yeah, we're taking stump cut bald cypress out of the swamp and developing them over a 3-year period into hopefully what they can something that they can be proud of. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I've seen some really like great results from these trees because there's quite a few of the members very local to here. And one of the things that, and I mentioned this earlier, one of the things that you are instructing is not only how to grow a flat top bald cypress, but also to get bald cypress knees. And and a lot of people are not very familiar with it because bald cypress has a very broad range. It actually grows anywhere from the tip of Florida all the way up into the very top, like almost into Canada. It's like in Maine.
Yeah.
But the knees are something that we see predominantly in more of a southern humid climate. So you could see it like anywhere from Houston into Louisiana and up into Tennessee. So for those of you guys that are listening or are curious, look up bald cypress knees, and if you haven't seen it before, it's really something like it's something crazy. It looks like it's on another planet. But to get them to grow in a pot, the theory had always been that you have to grow a tree for a long, long time, and then submerging them in water is kind of like one of the methods. It's gotta be a bonsai for a certain amount of time, but you've achieved this in a shorter amount of time than decades that people have claimed.
Yeah, I collected one, let's see, year before last. Put it in a mortar tub. Now it was a fairly large tree. I think it had about 16-inch spread at the soil line. But the following, I collected that in winter, and by the midsummer of that, the next year, I had knees popping up. So you can, first of all, the tree has to be at least 12 years old before it'll develop knees. Unfortunately, it's, once the knees develop, it's one thing that you really cannot control the size of. Previously, people would try to find bald cypress with the knees already on them. The difficulty there is that most of the time the knees are so out of scale with the tree that it just looks bizarre. It doesn't look natural at all. But when you're growing them, the knees, they don't just, shoot up to a foot in height. I mean, it depends on how much water you have, how deep the water is. There's a lot of different factors, and then you can control it. At a certain point, you remove the tree from the tub of water, and you just continue to make sure that the soil stays wet. The knees will grow, but they'll grow at a very slow pace. And so I've had knees on one cypress that that popped up, and I got 23 knees all in 1 year. And the biggest one is maybe about 4 inches high now, and the others are like an inch, 2 inches. So it's much more in scale with the tree. But yeah, water is the key. And we've done a lot of experimenting over the years, students of mine, myself, in developing them. And it doesn't take, probably the average would be, 2 to 3 years. Growing them in water to get knees to develop.
And you said they have to be at least 12 years old, so that's at point of collection.
Yeah, the studies have, and I've I've tried to make bald cypress my mission in life because of Vaughn, and trying to pick up where he left off. And I've read so much research and so many studies on bald cypress, and that was some fairly consistent information that I ran across, is that they won't start developing knees until the trees reach the age of about 12 years. So now there's a lady in Baton Rouge was in a workshop with me here last year. She had a bald cypress that was, maybe 3 inches in trunk diameter, but she had a knee, and the knee was like as wide as the tree and then about 3 inches tall, and it was very rounded on the top. And she was very upset because she says, I wanted it to be pointed. You can control what happens above ground, but it's really difficult. You really can't control the shape of the knees when they come up, But the problem was, even though she had had the tree for like 15 years, it was out of scale. So here's the knee is as wide as the diameter of the tree trunk, and so she was not happy with it. And I said, well, if you're going to grow knees, I would suggest having something with at least a 9-inch base across the bottom. That way, when you start getting knees, at least they're in scale with the tree. And 9 inches or larger, I think, at the soil line would be a good rule of thumb if you're going to try to develop knees.
Mm-hmm. And also one of the people that I collect with and I talk bald cypress with a lot as well is Nate Murray. And he's collected quite a few trees that are smaller, and then they'll have knees growing directly off of the tree.
Yeah.
And that I've found that's more common. But some people don't like that. Some people prefer the knees to be in the soil line, whereas I think the knees growing on the tree is a different thing. And I don't know what causes that. And I know you wrote like a short, no, not long, well, longer than I probably have written on any kind of research on bald cypress, but you wrote a nice little article about the development of bald cypress knees. Is there anything you found on bald cypresses that, like, growing on the trunk versus in the soil line? Did you find anywhere in your research about that?
No, yeah, but it doesn't surprise me. I think a lot of it just depends upon the water level. In the swamp, we have, you have a dry season and you have a wet season. And the wet season is usually from about March through September, and then the dry season, of course, during the winter months. But sometimes, if the water level gets higher up on the trunk, then the knees get higher. They always grow to a point a little bit higher than the average water level during the wet season. But if you've got and they only grow on the surface roots. I've got one I was showing a friend of mine just a couple of days ago on a bald cypress. I've got there's a root that's, the diameter is maybe somewhere between pencil lead size and pencil. It's not very big around, but here's this sort of peanut-sized knee that's starting to develop on it. So they will develop on very small roots. So if you've got fibrous roots that are coming off of a tree real close to the trunk, they will certainly start throwing up knees right up next to the trunk. And as they grow, because the water level gets higher, they just fuse right into the trunk of the tree. Mm-hmm. At least that's my interpretation of it. I don't think that knees normally grow off of the trunk. I think that they wind up getting fused to the trunk because they grow really close to it. And as both grow, then they just sort of become one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got one tree in my personal collection that was collected I think somewhere around, I'm trying to just kind of guesstimate because it was collected by Nate, say probably 4 years ago now. And I potted it up into a mortar tub whenever we got it. And it's been I think part of it could be the mortar tubs and the shallow cut. Like right when you collect the cypresses, one of the things that I know a lot of beginners will kind of stumble with is when they collect their trees, they don't cut the bottom flat enough to get it into a shallow container in the future.
Right.
Because if you leave any amount of that taproot below, that cypress is going to really take advantage of that taproot, and it's going to put all those roots down there, and you're going to have to cut those taps off, and it's going to set the tree back again, pretty severely. So one of the things that me and Nate were kind of looking at when we collected this tree was we made sure that every batch of cypresses that he collects, we cut them up really close, and then we go ahead and just put them straight into a shallow container.
Yep.
And this tree in particular had a section where there was 2 knees that popped up. When I repotted it this past season, I put it into a smaller bonsai container to kind of slow it down because I didn't want it to grow like a weed. That's one of the issues that one of the few cons to growing a bald cypress is that sometimes they're too aggressive. But it grew really well, and then I potted it and I found these 2 knees, and so I brought those knees and I brought them up a little bit, and they're just like right in the perfect spot, right in front of the tree where I would like my front to be. But they haven't this year. I've been growing the tree and kind of working on branch development. I haven't been letting it kind of grow out too crazy, but the knees have probably increased by a few millimeters this year, barely. So when you get those little stringy kind of roots that have the knee on them, like you described, I've actually seen those in person, like when I've been at, a few of the club meetings, and those knees have some height to them, even though they have such a small root.
Right.
So I don't know, and I'm also running the tree that I'm describing that's in my collection. I'm running it in Akadama, pumice, and lava. Mm-hmm. And I haven't really seen any difference between it and the other soil type that I'm using, because I know there's a lot of back and forth about what soil is good for bald cypresses. So, and I was told, and this is just something
you get in some downright arguments with people.
Yeah, but people will really get upset about it. And
they do.
And one time I was actually chatting with Guy Guidry back, this was probably 6-7 years ago when I was really starting to get into it, and I was really pushing for information. And I was like, hey, Guy, what kind of soil do you recommend? And I was really getting into it. And Guy was like, you don't really have to try too hard. I mean, a tree will grow in styrofoam if you plant it in there. I mean, and he kind of just told me that, and I'm like, interesting. So as long as it's water retentive to some extent, especially with cypresses, is kind of what we were talking about. He's like, cypresses will grow in crap, but they'll grow in topsoil as well. Yeah. And I've seen roots develop in both, but I mean, there's no definitive answer. Like you said, you could get in long, heated arguments and conversations about that type of thing. But I mean, is it really worth worrying about what they're planted in?
Yeah, well, for me, and Guy's a good friend of mine, and we've known each other for forever. Guy has never been concerned with growing knees on his bald cypress, and he's got some beautiful bald cypress and has created some magnificent specimens over the years. For me, I like growing knees. That's just this to me. The presence of the knees helps to create the more natural setting for these things in the deep South. And it sort of helps to transport the viewer to that place in the swamp where, okay, yeah, here's a beautiful tree, but here are the knees as well. So I like growing the knees. And I've gotten into discussions with a lot of people about soil, and everybody has their preferences for soil. Most of mine are growing in just Miracle Grow potting mix with moisture control, so it keeps them really wet. One of the things that I discovered years ago was when I was growing these, the very first time I had them pop out, I was concerned about them growing out of scale with the tree. So I immediately took the tree out of and it was in a bonsai pot, growing, and the bonsai pot was in a mortar tub that I kept filled with water, and the water was up to about the lip of the pot. But when the knees came up, I immediately pulled the pot out of the water because I was afraid that the knees would grow too fast. And what wound up happening was about more than half of the knees died. The roots they were attached to did not die, but the knees eventually they just rotted away because the tree didn't need them anymore.
Yeah.
The lack of water sent the message to the tree, you don't need these things. And so, it just, that kind of launched me on a research of knees and what happens to knees and how they grow and why they grow and the reason for their existence. And that's a whole nother topic, the reason for their existence. But anyway, so I don't think it matters a whole lot what you grow them in, as long as they get plenty of water.
Mm-hmm. So, and one of the things that I want to do this year is when we come around back to bald cypress collecting season, I want to pull 3, maybe 5. I don't know. Depends on the type of experiment that I want to do. Is I want to pull, I think 3 would be a good controlled environment kind of thing. So I'm not overworking myself with these trees. Is put 1 in Miracle Grow, like you've said, and then put 1 in traditional bonsai soil mix, like Boone mix, like my other tree, like I've described as in. And then for the third one, I don't know, like maybe I'll try, because I've grown a lot of the trees in what we use at Underhill. It's small lava, slightly medium size pumice. It's still a little bit on the small side. Some pine bark, which I find to be a little unnecessary because it's organic. It goes away eventually. And then True Grow, which is a Texas mined, sort of like Haydite, but it's for rooftop gardening. And Doug's done some research on it, and he thinks it's the truth. So, but I haven't seen any difference between it and pumice. I think pumice is still better when it comes to water retention. And then as far as a third mix, I want to do something a little bit more different. Maybe I'll go straight just pumice and lava and see if there's something happens. Or I know that Joel Jenkins is trying just straight akadama on one of his trees. So
right, that's what Hurley Johnson in Texas. He told me he uses straight akadama on his bald cypress.
Really?
Yeah, I found that interesting. But I'm not quite as as free with my ideas on soil as Guy, and that you could grow it in bald cypress and styrofoam. But I don't think it matters a whole lot. I mean, the main thing is just where people run into trouble is not giving them enough water. I've had people, talk about their trees and say, here in the heat of summer in August, well, my foliage is bronzing up and it's turning brown, like they normally do in summertime. And I'm going, no,
they shouldn't be. Yeah,
that's not. If that's happening, then there's a problem going on with the roots in the soil. It's not, it's not just what they normally do. Mm-hmm. But so many people just come to, think that that's what they do, at least in pot culture anyway. So, but water to me is just, that's the primary ingredient. And just depending on then what you want to do in terms of whether you want to grow knees or not, just depends on how much water you give them. Yeah.
And I think bald cypresses have more than proven themselves to be the tree that can grow in just the worst of situations when it comes to soil quality and location. Like if it's drier, if it's just in water 100% of its life. And you do mention the thing about the bronzing in the summer. And I actually had somebody contact me a little while ago, like via email. They had collected a tree with me in February, and then they said my tree's looking ragged. And one of the things that I noticed is that a lot of the people that go out and they collect trees, they put them in these black mortar tubs. And I think one of I don't know how, you have a little bit to a lot more experience on this than I do, but I believe that the mortar tubs get really hot, and then the edges of those root systems get a little burned sometimes. They don't necessarily get scorched, but that warmth is just a little too much, and it causes them to retract. And that could also cause the trees to kind of retract a little bit too, and try to protect themselves from that black container. And me and Carmen literally just did an episode, a few episodes back, where we're talking about watering, how important watering is. And if we catch our cypresses in that part of the day when it's the hottest, and we recycle that water and we replace that hot water with cool water, we might just be able to catch it back up.
Yeah, I'll tell you what I this summer, because it has been unseasonably hot this summer. I mean, 105, 100. I mean, we don't normally see those kinds of temperatures in New Orleans. But not just with my bald cypress, but with several other trees I found getting stressed. And what I did was I just went out with some old bath towels, and I drape it over the soil and the pot. And I use a light color, like an old white. And a couple of times, just old white T-shirts, draping it over the soil and the lips of the pot. To help keep the temperature down on the pot, and also to help retain a little bit more moisture, keep down the evaporation from occurring so rapidly in the middle of all this heat too.
Yeah, that's a really great recommendation to take, as far as especially on bald cypresses, because I even talked to Dawn about this kind of stuff when it comes to covering them. I've seen this a little bit. I don't know if this is a direct connection to too much sun on their flutes, but I've heard that too much sun on their flutes during the hottest part of the summer could even sunburn them. And so putting a shirt or a towel on them could even help relieve that kind of stress as well. And sometimes you'll get dieback on your flutes, and it might just be because also that root where it was cut and during any collection, it's getting a little dry on the surface where those new fibrous roots are trying to grow out. But I think it's a little bit of everything too. I mean, the white T-shirt thing and the white towel, whatever, your towel's going to get ruined. But I much rather would save my tree, get a cheap towel every year.
Yeah. I've never heard about the flutes getting sunburned, but I've certainly seen people's flutes die back and rot because they wound up when they were collecting it, cut too close and cut too much of that base off. Some of these flutes, they don't all go out real in a regular diameter around the trunk. Some wind up being longer and stronger than others, and you can't always see what you're cutting beneath that mucky soil. And I know a lot of people who've gotten cut off a little bit too much, and maybe there's not even any roots on the bottom of that flute where it was cut, and it'll die back up the trunk, and then they've got a different kind of design issue to have to deal with. But I mean, I certainly know that other trees, other species can certainly, surface roots can get sunburn and die back on you, the tops of them. Elms are bad about that. Jap maples too in our heat down here. Yeah,
and I mean, just that little bit of surface where you have your soil, you have to really think about like the first half inch to even sometimes a full inch, depending on the surface area of your soil in your pot. Any of that could be at jeopardy during the hottest time of the year when that evaporation happens right there. And that's where dehydration happens to those roots. But yeah, as far as cypresses getting dieback on their flutes, that's not the end of the world, because I've seen the sides of the flutes catch up and actually make good roots. And then you can carve that flute to make it look like it's almost like two or a slight hollow. Yeah. So there's pros and cons to that type of stuff happening with them, but yeah, that's kind of getting into like we're talking about collecting a little bit, and we're talking about like like aftercare, so it's kind of bouncing back and forth. But before we wrap up on this, I wanted to kind of go over one more topic. I noticed that you have on the Bald Cypress Facebook group, you've written quite a few articles that you're kind of releasing throughout the month or whatever. You've just kind of been popping stuff on there. And one of the ones I saw a couple of people were kind of back and forth on was your Bald Cypress tip pinching technique for refinement.
Right.
It's interesting. That's something I don't feel like a lot of people talk about, because it's a conifer in the cypress family. So you could theoretically pinch the tip of the growing leaf, because every leaf has potential to grow into a branch.
Right.
So
yeah, I think the biggest disagreement has been, and look, there's always going to be disagreement. I mean, I don't do this so that everybody's going to agree with me. All I can do is say, look, I started growing my first bald cypress in 1972. And I've made it my mission in life through Vaughn, Dave DeGroat, and others to learn as much as I can about them. But bud pinching, if you think about it in terms of like units of energy, the disagreement comes. Some people think that the way to get better ramification is through leaf stripping. So you strip all of the leaves off and you get better ramification. From my experience, that's a secondary benefit. It's not the primary function, and it's not the main thing that happens. The main thing that happens from defoliating any tree is a reduction in the leaf size. Now you will get some back budding, but look, once a tree has expended the bulk of its growth energy, and here we are in July or August, and you strip all of those leaves off, the tree only has so much food in reserve. And so when it starts pushing out a whole new set of leaves because it has to survive, then that's what makes those leaves smaller. But you weaken the tree in the process, and the tree is not going to be gaining a whole lot of ground in terms of growth for the following year by depleting it of all of that food and energy. But by bud pinching, as the growth is just coming out, and you just pinch out that compressed tip of each of those little leaves that are beginning to elongate, you stop the growth. You're not robbing the tree of growth, but you're forcing it then to pop buds in other places, because the tree is going to expend all of its normal amount of energy, whether that's 50%, 60%, 70% of their stored food over from the winter months. They're going to push it out. And so by pinching all of the tips, to me, that forces a lot more back budding and growth, which is, if you're trying to get twigging and fine ramification, certainly works a lot better than defoliating.
Yeah, and I think for such a strong tree to suddenly just do a reset on it's going to do all the wrong things, especially if you're trying to get some kind of balance in your cypress, because full defoliation, like you said, will give you a smaller leaf, but the tree is always going to be apically dominant. So you don't even have control over balancing the top. Like, you could pinch more out of the top and then leave the bottom to do intact, to keep doing its thing, to develop your first branch and second branch. But you're doing, in my opinion, it's like doing the tree a disservice just to strip all those leaves, because, like you said, it only has so much stored energy.
Right. And that's, and I think people start defoliating and bud pinching, way before they should. And I mean, way before they should in terms of the development of the tree, because, if you're trying to get smaller leaves, you shouldn't be worried about that until you've got all of your primary, secondary, and tertiary branch structure, the diameter that you want it, and and in the places that you want it. Then the bud pinching and defoliating, that should be like the last stage of development in any tree, but in particular bald cypress. And you don't have to, if you want to redirect growth, you don't have to just go in and pinch every leaf. You can just pinch out the tips of the new growth, not necessarily each individual leaf. Like you're saying, they're so top dominant. So here you've got these shoots coming out of the top, and they're getting really out of hand. They're getting too thick in relation to some of the other branch structures. So you just pinch out the growth tips. And then once you've eliminated those active auxins, then the other auxins that are kind of dormant, not really doing a whole lot, all of a sudden the energy is put into those to back bud, to start elongating other shoots on the tree, because it's going to push out and use a certain amount of energy for each year's growth. So I would much rather pinch buds to get smaller leaves than defoliate. Nothing wrong with defoliation. I mean, a lot of people do it. I just think for bald cypress, if you're trying to keep it strong, and look, I've done bud pinching on a tree 2 years in a row. It's an aggravation because you got to be out there every day pinching those buds before they get too long, get that collapsed tip out of there. But after doing so, I've gotten so much back budding. Now there's so many growth tips for that energy to go into. I don't have elongating leaves anymore. The most I might have is maybe 2 inches throughout the entire tree. And if I would, like this year, I didn't do any bud pinching, but on a particular tree, but everything's like within 2 inches, and given the size of the tree, I was happy with that.
And like you were saying earlier, with developing their branches, I mean, just by allowing them to just grow like they normally do without having to worry about too much about developing and refining, they will, like, that's I think what I was kind of thinking about there is whenever people do a chop on the top and they're trying to grow their new leader out, and they get to refinement too fast. They don't let their top leader grow they don't let it grow enough to match the taper.
Right.
That's kind of stuff needs to be taken care of first as well. And also the healing of wounds that you might cause, because I see a lot of people collect bald cypresses and a lot of people chop them. And then a lot of people don't treat the wound at the top right either. So I think I've even seen people get to the point where they'll collect a tree, they'll carve it, and try to get that new leader to start going. And then right when it gets to the point where the tree's going to start running and it's going to start getting that good taper and it'll start rolling the cambium, they've already chopped it and they've already done the defoliation, and they're trying to get like that bald cypress look already. Yeah. So it goes a lot of different ways with just the way that these trees are treated.
Yeah. And it's just a symptom of that all bonsai art, not all, but most bonsai artists are in too big a hurry to try to develop their tree. Everybody wants the finished product ASAP. And you've got to be patient, and you got to let some of these things run their course and just grow wild, because you've done so much to them, collecting them out of the swamp, chopping the trunk. Now they don't have any. There's not a single branch on the tree. It takes more than a year for those trees to really fully recover. They recover fast, but if you want to maintain the maximum health and as you say, get proper taper and development, that's got to be first and foremost. So there are times I've had a couple of trees where I didn't even let a branch grow. I just rubbed off every bud on the trunk because I wanted that leader. I wanted all of the energy that tree was going to put out for a couple of years to be focused in developing the leader, and they would get up past the roof of the house.
Yeah.
But by not letting any branches develop on the trunk and forcing it all to go up into that single leader, then you're able to develop taper pretty quickly, and you get that big scar healed over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of one of the coolest things you can do with bald cypress is that you can have them just grow 1 leader out and then cut them back, and they will back bud up and down the trunk. Unless there's major issues somewhere down the line, they will always back bud onto their trunk. So
yeah, just hundreds of buds.
Yeah. Like I'm building a informal upright, and I was missing a spot right where my chop is because they don't really bud on the scar tissue too well. You could do that with some like approach grafting stuff if you really need to cover it up. But I had a bud pop right there because I was starting to kind of bring the top down. I was starting to bring the energy down, and a bud popped like right below the chop. And then it gave me a perfect opportunity to run that out, wire it up into position. And at the end of this year, I'm hoping it'll be roughly about the right girth for me, so I can just cut it off in the spring and then start building it. So they're really a versatile tree, and I don't think people take into consideration all the techniques that could be honed in. Is like almost as unique as like a juniper or a Japanese black pine or a Japanese maple. They have their own development factors and things to consider with them.
Yeah, absolutely, and they're so forgiving, but it's there's so many. One of the interesting things that I've found from the bald cypress Facebook group is, there's a heck of a lot of opinions out there about different things. Some great looking trees, but some people have like really strong opinions. I don't know what their opinions are all based on. I don't know how much research they've done, and studying, reading books and research articles on bald cypress. But yeah, people get some really strong opinions, and man, they want to fight to the death to defend, defend some of their ideas.
And that's just how bonsai is just going to be like that. And I mean, there's so many other artists, like overarching styles, that people are saying that they're following this master's techniques versus, this person who's doing something innovative. And it's all the internet exposure nowadays. It's kind of, and I mean, we're kind of doing our own thing here. It's like we're doing this show, and we're putting our own thoughts into the ethos. So, so there's a lot of different ways to go with it. We can't tell anyone what's right or wrong. So, but I mean, but I see, like, if you guys want to go check it out, for the listeners out there, you can go to Facebook, go to Bald Cypress Bonsai. Randy, you're one of the creators of the page, I believe, right?
Yeah. I put it together. After urging from some of my students who said, you got to get with the 21st century here.
Yeah, it's.
I said, okay, because I'd never even had a Facebook page, Instagram, or any of that kind of stuff until a month ago, and so it's been an education, but a really thrilling experience for me to see how many people around the world are experimenting and growing with growing bald cypress. I mean, I had a guy late last night. I would check the Facebook page before going to bed, and here's some guy in New Zealand who's acquired some. I'm not sure how, because they don't. I don't know if he had to mail order them or what he had to do, because they don't grow there. But excited and showing me pictures of his bald cypress, and it's like, I had no idea that there were people around the world trying to grow our native bald cypress.
Yeah. One of the biggest surprises for me when I initially had launched the show, and I was talking to a guy in Australia, he says that they love bald cypress there, but of all places in the world, like Australia, it's crazy to think. Right. And he said what they do is they get seeds, and then they put them in these big water vats, and they let the seeds grow up in basically just muck. And then they they grow them as much as they can, and they don't get the fluting and anything crazy. Like they don't really get like the quality of the knees and the flutes and the flare and all that stuff that we can get, but it's still cypress. And
yeah.
And I could see that in some of the trees that people have that I've like you've mentioned. Like you go in here and you read like, oh, this tree's in New Zealand. There's this tree's in the UK. This tree, like this and that. And I mean, sometimes people get lucky and they have a way to get them imported or find somewhere. But growing them from seed, that's the next best thing. Then you really got to wait, but you'll have a really great tree. So.
Yeah. I was another guy sent me pictures of his tree from Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just like, man, this is exciting stuff, and that there's so many people interested in bald cypress, and it's such a wonderful species to work on and so forgiving. I recommend bald cypress to beginners more than any other tree because it is so forgiving,
Yeah, and I try to be a little touch and go on recommending bald cypresses to beginners because of all the other information out there. Because I mean, I'll recommend a Chinese elm. I'll recommend a Procumbens nana, juniper, and then if they're feeling really like if they want to get into bonsai, yeah, bald cypress is next. But I would say for all the people out there that are listening that want to get into bald cypress, take it slow. Take a lot of me and Randy's advice on this when it comes to. I mean, don't get ahead of yourself and don't neglect the tree. I mean, it is very resilient, but just, you see that burst of growth. That's because the tree's struggling to survive, not, oh, I'm ready to be chopped and carved. So that's kind of where it goes. But yeah, we'll start wrapping it up here, Randy. Just have some closing remarks. So for the listeners that have listened this far into the episode, thank you so much for listening. Like mentioned before, you can support the show by going over to patreon.com/little things for bonsai people. And you can support the show at a $1 level per month or a $5 level per month. And you can become a bonsai best bud, and you can come into our Discord chat and hang out, talk bonsai with our little community of bonsai enthusiasts there. You can also go over to underhillbonsai.com and check out stuff that I've written and our online store. And for you, Randy, you don't really have a lot of information out on the internet because you said you're pretty new to it. But is there anywhere else that you can think of that you would recommend?
No, I think I'm just excited that you and Doug have chosen the Folsom area to have a fabulous nursery that's so close to New Orleans and Slidell and Covington and other areas. And you guys are just doing a phenomenal job up there. And every time I come and visit, I'm amazed to see all of the new growth and progress within the nursery up there. And I just want to commend both you and Doug. And I know you're working your guts out up there. And it shows, believe me. It's just really impressed with the way the operation has grown over the years. And you guys just keep up the good work.
Oh, thank you so much, Randy. But yeah, thanks for hanging out and talking bald cypress and bonsai. Like that's what I do just about every single day. And I know a lot of people who are enthusiastic about bonsai. It's kind of what they, eat, sleep, and bonsai. So,
yeah, right. Well, I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, definitely, Randy. You have a great one, and thank you to the listeners for hanging out with us today. Y'all have a good one.